Hi there! Today we're going to make the squiggly knit scarf. I'm using cream squiggly and you'll need the 25mm single pointed pair of needles like these. Your first step is to create a slip knot. So if you create a loop like this with your working yarn end crossing over the top, bring your hand through, grab your working yarn to create that loop, and then pull your tail and your working yarn to tighten, and then your working yarn to make that loop, and then pop onto your needle. So now we're going to cast on some stitches. So take your second needle through the loop you've made behind your first needle. Make sure you're grabbing your working yarn and ignoring the tail. Go underneath the second needle and round between the two. Pull down a little to create a bit of tension. Slip the second needle underneath, catching that stitch. So your second needle ends up on top of the first. Now pull them away from each other slightly. Take your first needle and go from this side, so the side closest to you, bring it under the loop and out to slip the stitch onto your first needle. So then you have two stitches. I'll show you that again. Second needle underneath, working yarn around in between, pull down slightly, not too tight, just so you can catch that stitch with your second needle to bring it over the top. Pull apart a little bit, that was a bit rough there, pull apart a little bit, then take your first needle round the back, so closest to you, and bring it through that way to slip that stitch onto your first needle. So you can see how the stitches are building now. So I'll just show you one more time. So we're inserting the second needle underneath the first, bringing your working yarn round in like an anti-clockwise direction through in between the two needles. So if you look at it that way, it's sitting in between. Then you're catching that yarn with your second needle, teasing it apart slightly and bringing your first needle towards your body and through to the front, and then you're taking your second needle completely away. So yeah, let's do the 9 stitches that we need for our scarf. Our next step is to knit the first row, so that's a particular kind of stitch. So the way that we do that is quite similar to how we cast on. So if you bring your second needle underneath your first and bring your yarn round in the anti-clockwise direction in between the two, just as before, and catching that stitch. And then instead of teasing apart and catching the stitch on the first one, we're actually just going to pull it off the first needle, which might make you panic, but don't worry. We've added yarn to it, so the knitting is growing. So you're just pulling away. So underneath the first, yarn round, catch that stitch and pull away. And now the process just keeps going the same. Underneath, round and away. So if you finish that row in the same way. After you finish that first row, you might find that your knitting is just twisting a little bit around your needle, so just give it a little rearrange. So as you can see, both sides look different. Here you can see, on the reverse, you can see the knit stitch beginning to form. And there, this bumpier one is called the purl stitch. So we've just finished in this position. And what we need to do next is a row purl, so which is different stitch, and this is how you do that. So instead of coming in underneath like that, we're doing the reverse. So you're bringing your second needle underneath from this way and on top. Then your working yarn is going to go still in an anti-clockwise direction round the second needle, give it a little bit of tension. Now what you're going to do when you pull this second needle through is you're catching the stitch that you just made, so we've got it there, and then we're pulling away, and this is creating a purl, which it'll become more apparent which side is which and what the effect is of the stitch as you go along. So we'll just do another. So you're bringing your needle over the top of the first this way, bringing your yarn round and your second needle underneath to catch it, the stitch, and then pulling off. And that is a purl stitch. So if you finish your second row all the way to the end. So we've transferred the knitting, the work, to your other needle and your other hand, and again you might find it as you're getting started it's sort of twisting, which you can just rearrange and have it and stretch out. There's plenty of give in the squiggly, so while you're learning, don't worry if your tension's a bit here or there. You can give it a little squidge out. So what we do is then pass the knitting back to your other hand, and you can see this is the knit row that you need to do, and you're just alternating the knit and the purl stitch from now on. So I'll do a few more and then I'll show you the work, and then you'll be able to identify if you get a bit confused later down the line, can't remember if you've just done a knit or a purl, because you will lose yourself in it. You'll be able to figure out which is which. So I'll just do a few more rows. So I'm on a knit row, and then I'll do a purl row, and then a knit row and a purl row, and then I'll join back to you and show you the difference. So I'll just pause here and show you how the work's going. So on this side you can see that there's this really lovely V shape forming, and that is your knit stitch forming. And then if you reverse, you can see that it's different, so it's also quite bumpy, and just a completely different texture, which I think adds a nice interest to the scarf. So this is the purl stitch. So if you find you're looking at your knitting and you can't really remember which stitch you've done, that will help you. So the work is in your left hand if you're right-handed, and the second needle in your right hand, and we're working a row. Then you'll be able to see right there's that lovely sort of upside down V shape. That is a knit stitch. And if you found that it was the other way, you know it's a purl stitch. So you're just alternating knitting a row and purling a row until you've done as many rows as the pattern says. So as you can see here, I've got my very, very long squiggly scarf. I chose to do the long version and use most of the 500 grams of yarn. But there is the option, if you'd like, to make a shorter scarf and then use part of the yarn to make a child's scarf, so sort of a mini-me matching scarf. So now we're going to cast off, and we'll insert the second needle behind the first as if we were to create a knit stitch, and bring wrap the yarn around the back in an anti-clockwise direction. Bring the second needle down to catch that stitch and off. So it's basically just a normal knit stitch. And then we're going to do that again so that we have 2 on the second needle. Now this is where it's different. You then want to take, let me get my needles sorted, take the first stitch and slip it over the second, like so, to just create the 1 stitch on the needle. And then you knit another one and repeat that. So bring your first needle in to just grab that stitch. You might need a bit of tension on your working yarn so that you can pull your second needle through and grab that stitch and then just pull away. And you repeat the process until you've just got 1 stitch left. Right, here we are, we've got 1 stitch left on our second needle, and simply to finish off, take the needle out and feed the rest of your yarn through and pull to secure. You can then weave in, trim the yarn and weave in the ends, or leave that and trim and then create a row of tassels, which I'll show you in a moment. If you'd like to create some tassels on the bottom of your scarf, trim your yarn to the length you'd like your tassels as a guide, so like this, and then you want to just sort of give a little bit extra and measure like a loop, like so, and then simply can thread the top of the loop. If you find the bottom stitch along with the V, pop it through both of those layers, find the loop, and then bring the ends through and pull like so. The reason I just said to give a little bit extra is just in case, because this takes up some yarn at the top, but as it happens it's worked out a bit longer, so you can trim it as desired. And then I'm just going to work all the way along and do the same. And there we have it, we've got some tassels on the bottom and you can trim them as desired. You need to make sure, so this is like an optional extra really to the pattern. It very much depends on what yarn you have left over, so if you'd really like to do the tassels, you'll need to have a slightly shorter scarf and leave enough to do that. If you check the pattern, there'll be a guidance in terms of roughly how much you could leave at the end to cast off and do your tassels, but it depends on how long you want them, but there'll be some guidance in the pattern if you have a look at that. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoy making this scarf.